In this episode of Lab Matters with me, Harriet Gould, Professor Ricky Wildman reveals another application for 3D printing and how his research is transforming the future of healthcare. So today we have with us Ricky Wildman, PhD. Ricky is a professor in chemical engineering and and a professor at the world's leading multidisciplinary research group, which is the Nottingham's Centre for Additive Manufacturing, also known as CFAM. So we'll come on to that additive manufacturing because that sounds very interesting, particularly in the area that you're doing it in, Ricky. So thank you very much for being with us today. Before we get on to your professional life, which is very accomplished, I want to find out how you got there. And we just had a quick chat before starting about how you grew up in Bedford, which isn't a million miles from where I am, in Cambridgeshire. So take us back there for a minute. Tell us what it was like growing up.
Well, yeah. Well, hello. Thanks very much for the invite, of course. So thank you. Yes, no, I grew up near the small town of Bedford. I was in one of the villages just outside, and yeah, I was the only child there as well. So um, uh, went to a normal school. Went to Ursula Taylor in Clapham. Um, and then to a secondary school just in just outside Bedford, Sharnbrook Upper, and yeah, of just very normal. I sort of developed an interest in science, in physics, as I went through school. I liked most subjects, I would say, but those more scientific and mathematical based subjects were the ones that attracted me. I seemed to have some kind of capability with them, so that gave me confidence, and yeah, so I ended up doing um, maths, physics, chemistry. I wasn't so good at chemistry, which is ironic, as we'll come on to my research, which is working with a lot of chemistry. But yeah, that time it was physics and maths, and I was keen on science, and I read The New Scientist, and one of my granddads was an engineer, and we used to chat, and he was into aeroplanes and motor cars and whatnot. And so I guess that's where a lot of it came from. My dad was very handy fixing cars and doing things around the place. So he was, I guess you would call him an engineer. And so that sort of seeped into me, I think, over time.
Hmm.
But I was particularly inspired at that time because particle physics was becoming very known. A lot of excitement around that. I was reading The New Scientist and whatnot, and there was these pretty pictures of, you know, what was coming out of CERN and whatever, and that seemed very exciting. And I ended up applying to Manchester University, University of Manchester, and going there to the physics department, really being inspired to go and do particle physics, which after that point I never did again. But that was my initial inspiration to be able to get there. Yeah.
Hmm. I'm just wondering what the differential was between the physics and math side of things and the chemistry side of things.
Well, I've often thought about that, and I think for me, um, physics was about rules that could be generalized and I could apply them. And so if I was particularly lazy at some points, then I could often figure it out without really help from the teacher or the subject books and so on. And um, at that level, most of the equations are of similar format, and you could pick up the sort of the nature of those. And I like that. I could figure it out. I could work out what the structure of a problem was simply from the sort of mathematical basis of it. With chemistry, a lot of that was more learning the names of the chemicals and the reaction types and sort of develop. It's almost as if you had to do more work for chemistry than you did with physics, and so physics came easier a bit to me, whereas the chemistry side of things was a little bit more impervious to my teenage brain, and yeah, I sort of followed the mathematical physics route. That felt the most comfortable for me.
Mm. And then on to particle physics, but which you didn't do beyond Manchester. What did you like most about it when you were doing it?
Well, it was kind of amazing, this idea. Like none of my family had gone to university, so I was the first person in my family to go into university. So I didn't really know about science. I knew about engineering from a practical point of view, about fixing things and so on from my dad and my granddad's experiences. But you know, science and doing science was a novelty to me. And you know, reading about the way that you could unpick, you know, the mysteries of the universe by, you know, firing neutrons and electrons at each other and following those, and amazing sort of images that come out of those experiments was really quite something to me, and it was very exciting. Of course, once I got to university, I was then exposed to many other flavors of physics, and it turned out that actually, you know, I was less interested in that aspect once, you know, once I was fully deep into to all the kinds of physics, the you know, flavors of physics that you know, that are available to us.
Mm. And did you have a particular lecturer that guided you through that?
Um, I the that's a really good question, because um, I did actually have a favorite lecturer. I had a professor, Albert Hillel, who supported me in the first and second year, I think, of university. And he was a great lecturer. He had a great manner, and so he was my personal tutor at that time. So he was, you know, I spent a lot of time with him, and I probably wasn't the best student then as either. So it was kind of a very new experience going to university, and you know, going from a village to a city is very exciting. And you know, he helped me understand you know, the difference between doing A-level physics and doing undergraduate physics. But where he was really great was in the manner in which he taught the subject. He had an ability to be able to communicate really well, to me anyway, quite complicated, complex um, uh, subject matter in a really easily digestible way. And I really enjoyed his lectures. They were quite inspiring. And he lent me one of his books once, which I never gave back. So whenever I go and look at my bookshelf and look at the undergraduate text, I'm always reminded by Professor Hillel, because because I still have his condensed matter physics book sitting on my shelf, which was very helpful at the time as well. Yeah, so yeah, he was my favorite.
Well, hopefully he'll be pleased to know that you've still got that book. I hope.
Yeah. Hopefully, he won't be chasing me for it.
Yeah, he might want you to sign it.
Maybe.
Yeah.
It seems about likely though.
So that was at Manchester, and then you went to Birmingham, the University of Birmingham,
Yep.
and that was for your to do your postdoc.
No, I did my PhD there. So initially, I thought that I wanted to do yeah, a physics degree when I was finishing. And I did have the opportunity to do that, but actually I decided at that point that I wanted to go traveling. So I took a year between Manchester and Birmingham to travel a bit and go and see the world and have that type of experience. And then when I came back, I went to Birmingham to do a PhD, and this was slightly different emphasis. It wasn't really physics at that point. It was much more engineering, but it was about uncovering the way in which things flow. And there was a sort of very strong application element in there that I wasn't really involved in, but it was about being able to make turbine blades and things like this. But my PhD was really about understanding how you can improve the processing by understanding the material properties and the flow much better. And that was really my really first introduction to fluids and fluid mechanics, which we weren't really exposed to in my physics undergraduate. But that was the first time I really sort of encountered those kinds of studies.
Mm.
Yeah.
I suppose does that come into chemical engineer under the chemical engineering
Well,
remit, or
yes, I was in chemical engineering. I was based in the chemical engineering department at Birmingham, but I was actually based in the materials engineering. And I guess this was probably the first time I really started to be multidisciplinary because I was based, I was associated with chemical engineering department, and my supervisor was in chemical engineering, but we weren't really what you would consider chemical engineers in the traditional sense. And a lot of the people around us, the different groups and the different students were mostly interested in material science or materials engineering. So they were studying different metals and alloys, or ceramics particularly was an area of quite a lot of interest at that point. And a lot of engineering products from these materials as well, and different ways of processing. So whilst I was in chemical engineering and I was associated with chemical engineering students and supervisors, I wasn't really doing chemical engineering. What I teach chemical engineering now, and I don't teach anything like like what I was doing in my PhD. So it was quite different.
mm, okay. So I've got here that you went to Loughborough University as well.
That's right. Yes, I had a short stint away from the university, and I spent some time in a company, and we were developing coatings. But I realized that actually that wasn't my calling, and then I moved back into university, and I went to Loughborough University, and I moved into a mechanical engineering department as it was then, but I was really doing what would be considered physics again. So I was doing a postdoctoral. I took up a postdoctoral position, and I was working with my manager, Jonathan Hundley, and we were studying the way in which, again, flows, but this time flows made up of particles. Well, by them, granules, powders, things like this, which are really quite intractable to be able to describe very easily. And so this was a sort of I was in mechanical engineering. I was kind of doing physics, but kind of doing chemical engineering as well. And so everything was starting to get mixed up at that point.
Interesting that you referred to it as not a calling, which suggests that you did find your calling, which is again another just an interesting notion that I think well, I do at least get used to hearing people refer to sort of vocational type careers as callings rather
Mm.
than anything so, oh, I don't know, so serious as science.
Well, at that point, I didn't really know what I wanted to do after I got my PhD, and um, how old was I? I was maybe 22, 23, 24 probably, and if I didn't go into industry, then I perhaps wouldn't have known whether I'd made the right decision or not. But as it turned out, that experience, though positive, and it was a learning experience, it did tell me that I wanted to do science, and my experience at Loughborough was very positive, particularly due to um, my manager, my supervisor there. It was a very positive experience that really helped me become really develop my skills in science and engineering. And yeah, so, certainly looking back, it was the right decision to make.
Mm, mm, interesting. I'm just wondering which bit to go to next because really want to give a good amount of time to what you're doing now because it's so interesting. So I wonder if maybe we can s- skip quickly to that,
Sure.
um, which I don't normally do, but I mean, it seems like, you're really preparing the future for us from what I've seen.
It's interesting because Loughborough does feature into that, and so it's at Loughborough is the place where I first started to work with additive manufacturing. So I was working in this field that I described, and that was sort of formative in terms of developing scientific skills and analytic skills, and I developed a lot of breadth in my expertise there. But at that point, a group came to Loughborough, who were called, I think at the time, the Rapid Manufacturing Group or something. And my colleague Richard Haig happened to be sort of in sort of the office next door, and we got chatting, and he said well, why don't you? Well, the kind of stuff you do is interesting and could help us. And why don't you come and help us do some additive manufacturing? And I was like, oh, yeah, that sounds interesting. And so over time, I got more and more involved with what Richard is doing and others, as well as sort of, exploring some of these other areas until eventually we all moved to Nottingham. And that's when really, I 100% went into additive manufacturing. But really what I do now is all based on the sort of the trajectory that I took of exploring these different areas, so that I now have sort of think of myself as a bit of a jack of all trades. But that's what additive manufacturing is really. It's engineering, it's physics, it's chemistry, it's all these things.
Mm. And even in an application context, it's everything.
Absolutely.
Um, so tell. I mean, you've worked with some companies that people would have heard of: AstraZeneca, Rolls-Royce, Canon, um, amongst others. So, but the one that was really interesting me was this the biology side of things.
Yeah.
Um, it says here, unlocking a new world of possibilities for medicine, and it's sort of next generation plasters, basically,
Mm.
but for
Yes.
inside our bodies.
That's right. Yes.
Uh,
Yeah, it's very exciting, and it's a really interesting area to be working in. I mean, this really stems from an interest in healthcare, and I spent quite a long time printing what we think of as pills and so on, to sort of think about how we could develop ways in which we can deliver medicine in a personalized way. And then, throughout that work, I sort of started working with other people who are also interested in therapeutic solutions, but more in the regenerative medicine space. And so, for those who don't know what regenerative medicine it is, it's really about using cells to be able to deliver repair or regenerate tissue and so on.
I
And
suppose
this
we're
was
used to hearing that be called stem cell therapy, or
Yeah, that's right. Yes. And that's very close to to the kind of work that we're doing. And this idea of being able to create we call it an intestinal patch or a living plaster. Um, it's really about being, well, a good example, sort of start from the problem, is that if we think about the gut, then in the intestine, those people who suffer from chronic intestinal diseases, you know, bowel disease or Crohn's disease and so on. Essentially, what one of the things that happens is the epithelial layer, the upper layer of the intestine is it's sort of been denuded, it's sort of been eroded away. And unfortunately for those people who are suffering from that, that also includes the bits of the tissue that hold the stem cells that produce the epithelial layer, which is the sort of the outer barrier of the intestine. And so if you lose the stem cell, you lose the ability to be able to repair your intestine, or just like with your skin is replaced on a regular basis. It's the same in the intestine. So you need this ability to be able to replace the cells and the tissue that constitute the intestine. And so our idea is, well, once you've lost the stem cells, you can't repair. Well, what if you then were able to manufacture um, a, a sort of an artificial tissue that contains the patient's stem cell, or a stem cell that's been sourced from some other part of the body and prepared in the right way, and then implant that into the patient and allow the body to regenerate the tissue itself. So that's the idea.
And what are the options right now without that type of remedy? If somebody's ceases to be able to regenerate their own tissues,
Well,
there.
there isn't much. There's obviously some medicinal therapeutics that are available, but they're not always successful, and they're not always successful in the long term.
Mm,
There is surgery, so one can resect the intestine and take part of that out, but there's obvious dangers there, and there's in many cases there's um, long time complications, or
mm,
continued complications all the way through life. And but if you don't do anything, the long-term outcomes are not always good, often lead
mm,
to cancers, colorectal cancers, or other forms of cancer that may form as well. So, the therapeutic choices are not great, but the disease outcomes are also very poor as well, ultimately. So, um, our idea, and I work with my colleague Felicity Rose on this. Our idea is to be able to come at this with a slightly different way of repairing the tissue. We're essentially repairing the tissue and giving the tissue its power to repair itself back
mm,
again.
mm. Brilliant. And would it only be for the intestine, or could this be used for other parts of our inner world?
Yes, we've worked on other organs, and we also sort of studied the cornea. You can also build these kinds of models for the lung, and other organs as well. Our particular interest is in intestine, but if this works, then a lot of the technology and a lot of the engineering that goes into this can be translated to these other organs. So what it requires to be able to achieve this is to be able to, and the reason why I'm involved is you need to be able to manufacture at a precision and with the right materials to be able to replicate the shape and the chemistry of the intestine, or at least the important parts of that. So the stem cells sit in basically niches in little cups. So we have to replicate the cups, and we have to use material that can host the cells, and the cells can survive and thrive, and it can be handled as well if it needed to be surgically implanted as well. And so all these sort of practical issues, and this requires some of the techniques that we use in additive manufacturing, and our particular expertise is in high precision, high resolution printing of soft materials,
That
so
are, that are
hydrogels
that are
and
absolutely tiny.
yeah, jelly-like materials, but we're talking about niches or cups that we can think of them as cups, holders that are um, a few tens of microns in diameter, and maybe around about 50 to 100 microns in height. So, 1/10 of a millimeter in height, and sort of half that size in width. And then you have to replicate that with precision in a particular arrangement that replicates what it looks like in the intestine. It's sort of a hexagonal arrangement of cups, a bit like a honeycomb, when you look at it through a microscope. So you have to be able to manufacture that. You have to be able to manufacture that with that level of precision, with this sort of tens of micron precision, but also at scale. So ultimately, these are going to have to be a few centimeters, so we have to make them big enough to handle, and they'll need to be different sizes depending on the condition of the patient and what the lesion looks like, and so on. And so everything that's good about additive manufacturing, being able to manufacture in a very personalized way, with bespoke, with very particular geometrical features, really lends itself to being able to deliver this kind of product. I make it sound easy, but it's very challenging. It's actually
Doesn't sound easy at
very
all.
difficult to get it right. So
It
yeah,
sounds otherworldly.
it's very exciting, but it's a very challenging project.
No doubt, no doubt. And I mean, you talked a little bit just there about the looking through a microscope. You're gonna obviously there's a lot of microscope work with these minuscule products. And it just made me think that it must actually cost a fortune to do this kind of research.
Yes, I mean it is research is expensive. There's no getting away from it, and particularly the research that we do, which is very practical, involves biology, so cells, also developing new chemistries and materials. So these are wet labs in the main, and that is expensive. And of course, in order to do research, you need people. And so altogether this does cost. Of course, it costs money. We're very fortunate to have funding from our funding agency EPSRC in the main, but also supported by some companies. The particular project that we're talking about is supported by a number of companies, in particular AstraZeneca, Johnson Matthey, GSK, and others involved in this project. So it's a big team effort. This particular project is staffed by in total around 30 people across 5 universities. It's going to run for 5 years. It's a long-term effort to be able to deliver this kinds of science and engineering. But the end is worth it. If we can really understand and we can really manufacture this, then the hope is that in time we'll be able to help people who are suffering from these really quite unpleasant chronic diseases.
It's transformational. It sounds, yeah, like I said, you're preparing the future for us.
Hopefully.
Hopefully,
Yeah.
fingers crossed. It sounds like you're making good progress. Um, and I think it's easy to carry on. We could talk about that for forevermore, I expect. But is there somewhere that we can go to see updates, perhaps, on the work that you're doing? Have you got a website?
Well, we do have a website for Centre for Additive Manufacturing. It's hosted at the University of Nottingham platform. I also have a LinkedIn page, which I'm sure you've seen, and I try to post regular updates on that. And as new things come along, we like to tell people about the latest advances, particularly when we've say published an article and we've got a major advance to report. So yeah, those are the main places where you can find updates on what we're doing. Of course, if anyone's interested, they can reach out directly to me, and I'm happy to talk to anybody about our research.
Excellent. And how long do you think it'll be before we can use what you're making now?
Oh, that's a good question. So I think the hope would be we're talking about 5 to 10 years. So it does take a long time. One has to be realistic whenever we're sort of talking about these kinds of therapies. We have to do the research that's going to prove that it works at an academic level, but then, of course, that has to be translated. And that's something that we're very keen on. We don't really start work that we don't think could eventually make it to um, to the public. But in this case, any therapy has to go through testing. It has to go through trials and then would have to pass the regulatory authorities. And um, uh, for good reason, that takes quite a while. So, the timescale is decade rather than years, unfortunately.
Well, I'm sure we can all be patient and look forward to the day when it finally happens. Just before we go, just in case there is something unobvious that you haven't mentioned already, what are your hopes for the future of science as a
Future.
whole?
Oh, wow. I mean, that's a big thing. I'm for science as a whole, uh, it's yeah, that's a really good question. I just hope that we can harness science towards the benefit of all. I mean, it sounds a very idealistic goal, but science is a method, and it can be used in many different directions. But as you can see from my research, it has a lot of potential for good if we can steer it in the right direction. Then the potential is really quite extraordinary. But it does take investment, and it does take, as we've already discussed, it does take money, it does take funding. And so, and really the research that I'm involved with and I'm most excited by, it's the research that involves multiple people, multiple disciplines, brings teams together, and really develops a strong collaborative effort to be able to achieve big goals. That's not to say the smaller things are not important, but these big goals in healthcare, in in climate change, in sustainability, and these take really big collective efforts to really to understand and then control and then deliver is the way I think about it. And if you don't have all those elements to your science and engineering, then you can get a little way, but you can't go really far. So yeah, it's really important to understand it, to really be able to develop great products, great solutions, or great therapies, um, uh, and get that into a place where you can go from a scientific lab into, well, what we're talking about, into a clinic, into the public arena, and be used by people. If it's not used, then it's interesting, but it's perhaps, in my view, not been as worthwhile as if it hadn't been used.
Mm, interesting. Professor Ricky Wildman, thank you so much for joining us for Lab Matters, and I hope we'll see good things from your neck of the woods before long.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invite.
Did you enjoy that episode of Lab Matters? If you did, please do send it to the people that you think will enjoy it the most.